Okay.
This is Roger. Can you hear me, Warren?
Yes, I think we lost
Roger.
Roger. All right, Roger, you're on mute.
No, I'm sorry, I lost the connection. I have no idea what happened. In any case, typically that would happen on the last session of the year. There you go. I'm lucky it didn't happen before. Okay, so I'm delighted to Adrian Favell, who is going to talk about his new book, The Integration Nation, Immigration and Colonial Power. Will be followed by a comment from Sara Wallace Goodman at UC Irvine. The floor will then go back to Adrian for a response, and then we'll open up for Q&A with the audience. So when we move to the discussion phase, if you would just raise your hand and I'll recognize you and give you the floor. Okay, so Adrian, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody from England. Thank you, Roger, and the CCIS and UCLA International Migration groups for the invitation. I'm looking forward to hopefully to seeing all of you for real in August, maybe at ASA, those of you there, perhaps on the 5th at USC. So I'm very pleased to be presenting a preview of my book, The Integration Nation, and I'll just move to share my screen now, and I'll be sharing for a while, and then I'll come off again to talk directly. So are we okay, Warren?
We're fine.
Yeah, good. So yeah, so as you may know, I'm very much identified as a scholar of the concept of integration in migration studies, and this book is in many ways a kind of return and a recycling, revisiting of all kinds of work that goes back a long way in my career as a scholar. And I feel in many ways that I've been saying a lot of this stuff, in fact, since the late 1990s, but I recently had the chance to visit it for a book with Polity. So this is the book. You can also find this in a couple of essays called The 12 Propositions, either in French or English, and there's a recent annual lecture with the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. It goes back to work that I did for the Carnegie Institute in the late 1990s on immigration, integration, research, and policy, in which I developed a critique of the ways in which mainstream immigrant integration research reflected and reproduced a certain form of nation building, typically in its modes of thinking. This critique of methodological nationalism then developed quite strongly during the next few years with various scholars, and there is a wave now of critical migration studies since the 2010s that are saying some similar things in certain ways. So that there's now a rich literature, I think, on the subject. Excellent work by people like Willem Schinkel, Anna Amelina, Janine de Hinden, Bridget Anderson. And I should say, I'm also from a kind of the critical migration studies point of view, I'm often criticized for using the word. The focus on integration is also problematic for a lot of these critical migration scholars. But I think this is all fine. But one of the problems that we have in the field, this sort of this particular configuration, I think, of critical migration studies versus a more mainstream research, and my mainstream research, I think of, kind of transatlantic agenda of both North American and European mainstream research, is that the critique simply has not been affecting the mainstream research. The mainstream research plows on, following the same sorts of assumptions, the same structures of research, without really engaging with this particular critique. And this is why I think there's still a necessity to present this kind of work and these kinds of debates, and hopefully to engage different kinds of scholars and in critical thinking about how we do immigrant integration research. A first point, obviously, is that in the US, there's been an interesting way in which assimilation research has blended into integration research over time, and not coincidentally, there's a book called Integration Nation, even that celebrates the ways in which this is a popular kind of work that celebrates how immigrants and refugees have been integrated in America and continue to sort of reproduce a certain sort of American dream through this particular process. And of course, a key work that I'll be referring to both implicitly and explicitly during this talk, Strangers No More, a comparative work of Europe and North America by Richard Albert and Nancy Foner, which is a kind of state of the art, if you like, of mainstream research in an international context, explicitly turns to integration as an alternative to typically talking about the same things in the terms of assimilation. So that's an obvious context in which this is relevant, I think, for the US debate. In Europe, there is, since particularly the refugee crisis, massive amounts of EU funding have been going into integration research. Countless projects and consortia framed around this concept, turning various sorts of models of research into policy in a cross-national European context, and it is a major kind of focus of EU funding as well as at the national level. Lots of it in Germany, where I'm working at the moment. Secondly, there has been in recent times an insurgent of quantitative integration research by RC28 type scholars. So the social stratification scholars, the inequality scholars internationally have got interested in immigrants and in applying the standard sorts of class and occupation model studies of inequalities and stratification to immigrant, to post-migration phenomena, and particularly to integration research in that context. And thirdly, I think there is an ongoing structuring of the debates by model-based approaches, particularly, I think, associated with the construction of various sorts of very ambitious international migration indexes, such as the MIPEX index based in Brussels, the Migration Policy Group, which I discuss in the book, which now stretches to 52 countries, looking at the laws, institutions, and frameworks of integration across the world and proposing various sorts of ideal templates, as it were, for what good and bad integration might look like. And this, I think, is an ongoing kind of work that also relates, of course, to the rather standard trope in migration studies of doing comparative work that reduces immigrant integration to different kinds of national models. A British multicultural model versus a French universalist model, or other variations on this kind of way of doing things, which is a hugely problematic way of thinking about this, but which continues to kind of be reflected in a lot of the textbooks, for example. Now, all of these various sorts of ways in which immigrant integration research continues, despite all of the critiques, suggests to me that there is a normal science of immigrant integration, a paradigm of immigrant integration research that needs problematizing in some ways. And this is what I center on, the idea of talking about immigration in terms of the standard terms of immigration, integration, and citizenship, as a core expression in some ways of contemporary Western liberal democracy and its self-conceptualization. Immigration, as we know, has come center stage in the whole definition of liberal democracy and ongoing political models. because of the question of migration, diversity, and all that. And so therefore, these sorts of mainstream models are in a sense, central to our thinking about society as such, which is why I guess we're all so busy as migration scholars these days in the social sciences. Now, I want to stress my critique of integration is not the usual ethno-cultural one. It is one that rather takes the whole paradigm of immigrant integration and its relationship to the formation of citizens and nation building out of diversity as the highest expression of an ongoing modernist development paradigm that can be traced back historically, back through 1950s development models, back all the way to its origin in structural functionalism and Durkheim, all of which is in the book, and which continues to be an expression of our, as it were, highest ideals of emancipation, or of individual, the emancipation and production of individual citizens as members of modern societies. And what I'm basically arguing in the book, to put it very crudely, is that this is an ongoing expression as well of a colonial paradigm, that Western nations continue to affirm their power and superiority in the world by these formulations of immigrant integration as a kind of progressive philosophy or progressive kind of model of thinking about society and how it works, emphasizing their ability to absorb, reunify, and draw power from immigration as a nation building practice. Another way of thinking about this is that it is, as it were, one of the contemporary expressions of the ongoing idea of a liberal democratic theory of justice in some sense. And integration, of course, equals equality, expressed through successful models of citizenship and achieving equality of opportunity for diverse populations and so forth. So that's the kind of context that I'm talking in, and there's a kind of obvious critique here going on of, in a broad sense, of philosophical ideals expressed in our contemporary research still in immigrant integration. So the next phase, I want to consider very quickly a series of images about integration, which are, as it were, provocations, but which I think get us into the problematic very quickly that I explore in the book. So what does integration look like? And the first image I take is from the famous iconic film of decolonization, Guillaume Pontecorvo's La Bataille d'Alger, 1966, the Battle of Algiers. The very first scene in this film, it's extraordinary when you go and look at this film. And if you don't know this film, you really should watch it. It's a fantastic film in which a group of French soldiers are gathered around a elderly Algerian man who has been tortured by the soldiers in order to inform them about the location of the Algerian Liberation Front leaders. And they have dressed him up in French soldiers' clothes, and they're going to take him to the Casbah to reveal the location of these leaders. And one of the soldiers takes a soldier's hat, and shoves it on the man's head, and he shouts out "Intégration" at this point. And this, in other words, is integration in a French colonial context as torture, bullying, humiliation, and compliance. Should get us worried, I think, about the concept. Second image from the film, even more chilling in some ways. One of those chilling parts of the moments in the film is when we were watching a group of Algerian women dressing up and getting made up as French-looking or European-looking women, leaving the Casbah before going out in the main city to plant bombs in the modern city centre in a French cafe. Now, this might be seen as a failure or perversion of integration, or it's typically talked about in Western contexts as in terms of radicalization and sort of something that's breaking with Western values and so forth. But the question, of course, that the film raises very poignantly is have they in fact successfully integrated into the logic of colonial violence that's being expressed by the French civilizationary mission in Algeria? And I'll leave this point hanging, but it obviously relates to the work of Frantz Fanon, which is in the background of the book that I've written, and about the struggle for decolonization. Now, these images are going to get progressively more attractive as we go along, but are they getting less problematic? The triumphant French football team of 2018, World Cup 1998 also was a highly diverse team, often presented by progressive scholars as a sort of celebration of the contemporary multiracial diversity of French, British, German teams as a highest expression of these nations against anti-immigrant and anti-diversity types of politics. But the question here is, this is 68 years later, have we moved on? And has France moved on, or is this in fact the same image as the first image that we saw, the Algerian man and the soldiers? After all, we give caps to footballers when they play for their nation, and the market for immigrant footballers is one of the great exceptions to immigration control in Europe, and the building of these teams is very much a building of from diversity that is being nationalized in some sense by a particular sort of process. And this process of selecting out or bringing in superstars is hugely selective and extractive, and an obvious kind of colonial process that's going on. Fourth image, Britain, and this is particularly good timing given what's going on this weekend in Britain. Multiculturalism, the pride of Britain, 2012, Britain celebrating the London Olympics, the gold medalists, again with this same kind of image, an image of diversity, of successful post-migration, post-minority nation building, building on British, the height of confidence of British ideas about itself as cool Britannia. If you remember the famous Olympic opening ceremony celebrating not only the British history, but also British rock music, James Bond, British fashion. Britain, of course, as a result of this kind of confidence in the world and the confidence with itself as it were, a sort of successful multiracial global nation, thought it was so great that it could vote to leave leave Europe through Brexit just 4 years later. We're currently living through the consequences of this in Britain, obviously. Now, what I want to suggest with this image, this is an image of biopower. And it's not some kind of simple Eurocentricity. It is a multiracial image of the nation, of an image of high modernity, of the British future, and it echoes a lot of what is said by the organization British Future, as well as academics like Tariq Madood on multicultural nationalism. A cultivated population in which the British dream is equivalent to the American dream in some sort of sense. It's a nation after diversity, a proud nation, and in some ways it's reflected also in the way Britain and British ethnic minorities think about themselves. They often will stress colonial history and racism and so on in Britain, but they would see Britain as more advanced in certain ways than continental Europe on the same sorts of questions. And I think this is something that British scholars really don't think about very, very well or successfully, although Siva Mohan Valovan's recent book, The Clamour of Nationalism, on the kind of the question of race and nation 20 years on from some of the classic work of Gilroy and Stuart Hall, is an exception to this, and which has some relation to the kind of things I talk about in the book. So these are kind of a series of images to get us thinking. I also want to stress that these are also images of neoliberal racial capitalism, to put it in crude terms. I'm not going to say very much more about this. We can go into this into discussion if you like, but what I'm trying to suggest is that it's precisely through these kinds of modes of thinking about the nation and the production of a certain sort of progressive discourse about the nation and migration as a driver of ongoing national success, which is how neoliberal racial capitalism precisely works, through immigration, integration, and citizenship. And this, I think, is the big message of the book. Now, I may have I may have sowed some doubts about immigrant integration and what it means and whether we should be more critical of it. You may have found, usually people find this all very nice and entertaining as a way of talking about the subject. But generally, mainstream researchers do not really respond to this criticism. They just carry on with what they're doing. And quantitative researchers, particularly, have paid very little heed, I think, to the kinds of critiques that are out there about integration, both mine and other authors. So I want to focus the rest of the talk, and we're about halfway through, on how integration is done, particularly in quantitative studies of integration, and particularly on this kind of transatlantic convergence of research that we've seen through scholarship like Albert and Fona, but I think that the general trend of scholarship towards a particular convergence in which European thinking about itself is very much in the mirror of the US and its modes of thinking about immigration and its kind of highest and most confident self-expression. So the kinds of questions that are organizing the rest of the discussion. Firstly, who do we identify as needing integration? Secondly, how do we judge when someone is integrated? And three, who is left out of the picture or left behind? And I'll stop sharing at this point, just talk with you for a while. So who do we identify as needing integration? We might think, well, this is self-evident, right? It's immigrants, or newcomers that we typically study. And very briefly, and I want to signal this is a really important analytical point in the book, is that this is hugely problematic because we only talk about immigrants because we always forget in migration research the 99% of people who are crossing borders who are not immigrants, but are mobile populations who don't need integrating, people who are moving across borders unproblematically. Immigrants are defined in relation to those people, but we don't really put those people central in the study. And I say 1 in 99 because that is the sort of figure that is the case in the British border before the COVID crisis hit. It also leaves out, thinking about immigrants, of course, is an obvious migranticization, which leaves out the often analogous and implicated populations that might be settled ethnic minorities or indigenous populations or empire subjects. And I'll come back to this point in a moment, but the focus on immigrants and their integration in the standard models is already problematic because of these two sorts of issues, which need rethinking. But just to leave that aside for a moment, the conventional continental European mode of identifying immigrants is the standard way of generating data on this. People who are born abroad, their parents or grandparents get counted as migrants who maybe first, second, third generation, who will disappear over time into the majority population who are generally called natives. And ethnicity in this picture is typically generated through national origin. You have different sorts of ways of dealing with this, and Europe is always very interesting because of the very diverse and confusing ways in which these questions generate data nationally in different contexts. For example, the UK also has questions about self-attributed racial or ethnic identity. There are intermediate modes like the Dutch and so forth. The combination of ethnic origin and migrant origin data to generate studies about immigrants as such, or immigration, or second, third generation migrant origin populations is very typical, of course, and familiar in North America. Now, it's a frustration, of course, over the years of North American researchers that European research doesn't have the kind of quality of data and systematicity of data according to the ways things are done in the US. But increasingly, of course, the powerful models of migrant assimilation have influenced and informed the construction of European debates. And there's interesting ways which we could go into, in which we could look at the history of how long it has taken, in some sense, for a well-established quantitative field of research to establish itself through the generation of data in comparable kinds of studies internationally. And I was certainly around at the the early days in the early 90s, the late 90s, when American scholars were really talking with the quantitative scholars of the RC28 and European Consortium of Social Research to try and develop the sorts of models that might work in a transatlantic context. And if you now look at the work that Anthony Heath or Kogan and Calter do, you can sort of see how this has evolved out of a certain sort of discussion that has brought in and developed and debated with the key reference in American integration, American assimilation research, of course, Doug Massey, Alejandro Portes, Mary Waters, but above all, Richard Alber, who was very much present in those earlier sorts of meetings. This is research, I'm being very brief here, but the research, of course, that is about statistically measuring how these populations are going to disappear in some sense into a native population, identifying culture and origins that cause disadvantage, or identifying, in other words, and a word used by Heath and Chung, the identity penalty associated with migrant or ethnic identity origin. And all of this work has now kind of come to fruition, I think, as a sort of normal science of quantitative research. Now, the points that I want to make in the critical work that I've been doing on this are the following. The first, of course, is that there's a very strange amalgamation going on here of migration, race, class, ethnicity, culture, which only becomes visible, and in something like Alba and Fona is the visible non-EU population compared to, i.e. European national populations, because Europeans don't have it. The ethnicity that these groups have, that the European migrants, the natives, as it were, do not have, a first obvious problem. A second problem is that it fails to really problematize the obvious issue of free movement and intra-EU migration. So Polish migration, very difficult to not talk about the Polish in a country like Britain, where they're the biggest quote unquote immigrant group. But are they ethnic? Do they have ethnicity? Are they immigrants? Not really, legally speaking, but they are in other terms. And they have to be brought somehow into this problematic, which is not obviously about just being EU or non-EU. And a third sort of dimension on this is that it's something that we might draw from work of people like Gominda Bambra, which is that an awful lot of the populations that get counted as migrant origin populations or immigrants in this immigrant integration research in European nation states were in fact post-colonial subjects who were never immigrants until they became immigrants retrospectively as part of the decolonializing process. So British subjects were not immigrants until they became immigrants in law in the 50s and 60s in order to be integrated as ethnic minorities, according to the model. And this is something that of course reveals how a lot of what we're talking about here is the formation of post-colonial metropolitan nation states out of empires that functioned in different ways in terms of their population management and generation of nationality, race, ethnicity, and so forth. So these ways of thinking, in other words, have racialized everyone, they've migranticized everyone, and they're minoritizing these migrants in relation to majorities who have been homogenized also racially as nationally the natives, as we're talking. Now, and I'm just being, again, very quick and very crude here. This is an American way of thinking about immigration, and it works for settler societies. It's the assimilation model, which everybody seems to be adopting increasingly in mainstream research and mainstream policy in Europe. But in the US, the classic immigrant integration nation model, the assimilation model of the settler society only works because of forgetting two minor details, of course. That the, first of all, or three minor details. The first is the population that the migrant origin populations are integrating into are not natives. They were also migrants at some point. So there's a kind of artificial construction of native population around whiteness. Secondly, of course, there's the Holocaust of the indigenous population, a sort of assumption about the nation as a tabula rasa. And thirdly, an oversight about slavery at the origin of the formation of the nation. In other words, that the race color line meant that there were not minority groups that had to be integrated, but rather two kinds of types of Americans, and that the race color line kind of stratified the structures. It structures its way all the way through American immigration and ethnicity research as a result of this. And these are points that lead me to conclude that I'm just going to check. is that the US model should not be really a prototype for the European model nations, but rather that we need to focus on the asymmetry of the comparison. And there's a particular point here, I think, that I'd want to develop, delinking European colonialism from Eurocentricity as such, as it's often presented in American context, because it's a different kind of colonial positionality in certain sorts of ways. We have to also factor in American colonization of Europe, that I think is very much reflected in these modes of thinking. Okay, second point, how do we judge that someone is integrated? Now there's a long discussion in the book about how qualitative researchers think that they avoid all of these problems, which are measurement problems effectively that quantitative researchers have, by proposing alternative ways of thinking about integration that are to do with things like interculturalism. I point to the ironies in ways in which we, as trying to recuperate integration through these means, when in the past we used to simply call it multiculturalism or anti-racism. And this, I think, is also a point about being made again by decolonial scholars. I mean, why can't we think seriously about these things not in terms of integration? But there's also a normative point here that ultimately it's impossible to avoid some sort of integration modeling along these quantitative lines because migrant minorities are, sorry, I've lost the strand here. Yeah, I argue in the book very clearly that it's literally impossible that migrants can both integrate and be, for example, transnational in their investments in society. There's a point in some sense to the Albert and Nee approach to these issues about the way in which migrants are forced into investing into assimilation, because it's literally impossible to do this without, in fact, disintegrating the host society in some sense. This is a normative point about sovereignty and why assimilation and integration are the same things. And what you find then when you go down to these local studies, which are often the ways in which these studies are operationalized, is that there is a way in which even in these studies, there is always a construction of a reference majority group in certain sense, into whom groups, the minority groups are integrating or interacting with. And the integration into what question is something that is always unavoidable in this kind of research. And this is where, of course, getting back to the point about the problematic nature of constructions of natives in order to provide references for minorities and migrant groups, is that, of course, when it is the minorities who have ethnicity, the mainstream natives implicitly don't, and ethnicity is always something that is disappearing into a particular sort of mainstream. And this is, of course, the production of whiteness in immigrant integration research. And whiteness, of course, can be a certain sort of translucentness. It can be something that is squarable with post-racial types of thinking, because it is a statistical invisibility, and the statistical invisibility expresses the norms of the nation, which are then reflected in the kinds of benchmarks that identify successful or unsuccessful integration, inequality or stratification between different sorts of groups. In the book, I talk about this as the black box of whiteness, what's left over always in migration research. And it continues to be a problem, even when quantitative researchers say, well, we're not constructing groups, we're working with individual variables, with control for class, education, culture, other sorts of behavior, X, Y, and Z, but there's still a residual, in some sense, of ethnicity that must be causing, or that is causing the inequality. And this particular kind of mode of constructing the research ends up reflecting the racialized statistical production in some sense in the studies.
Adrian, could you bring this to a close?
Yeah, I've kind of
maybe
had
another 5 minutes.
Yeah, I've been rushing through a little bit.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. I think there may be solutions to this with new kinds of majority-minority research and some of the kind of later works in super diversity, which we can go into in discussion. So a third point, very briefly, who is left out or left behind in all of this? And this is where I get to the kind of final sort of punchline of the work. Immigrants are asked to integrate. A lot of symbolic burden is put on immigrants to incarnate nation building through expressing the power of the nation to deal with immigrant diversity and minority diversity, cultural diversity, and so forth. But of course, we don't live in an integrated society. Modern societies are hugely stratified, they're hugely unequal. And not only is it the fact that those at the bottom of the end of the society often display lots of indicators of their non-integration, their anomie in society, but also, of course, we live in societies where the most successfully integrated modern individuals, as it were, the most successfully expressions of the production of modern individuals in a kind of developmentalist model are in fact free-moving, highly globalized, offshore elites, the people who live in gated communities or expat bubbles, who put all their resources offshore, who are able to secede from mainstream society. And yet, of course, none of these ways of thinking about integration would ever think of the migrants integrating to these sorts of benchmarks of success. And this stratification, of course, is typical of how neoliberal racial capitalism works. It's a point that you might see also very clearly in the work of Zygmunt Bauman about the polarization of the mobile and the immobile. And there's, of course, this huge irony, which is reflected now all through the populism debates going on in Europe and North America, that this stratification is also, of course, faced by the so-called native, sometimes white working class populations who are not integrated according to Durkheimian means, but who supposedly also symbolically incarnate the true integration of the nation. And the irony, of course, is how their frustration with the cosmopolitanism and diversity associated with immigration has been mobilized politically in order to deliver certain sorts of political outcomes. And here, of course, we get to the final two slides. If you're wondering who I'm thinking of course, I'm thinking of this gentleman, Boris Johnson, as an archetypal, an archetypal kind of successful global elite in some sense, person who's mobilized all of this politically. And this kind of then brings us to the sort of final image to wrap this up, which is the happiest image of all you could think of, the Great British Citizenship Ceremony, where a Syrian asylum seeker family is celebrating its success of becoming successful immigrants and on the pathway to citizenship. You have the Queen in the background to emphasize the sovereignty. You have the flags. You have the happy image of immigrant success. But of course, in this context of what I'm saying, this is also an image of branding. It's national branding, and it's precisely how value is put on a British passport at the expense of all those who don't get to be successful in this way. This could be a Polish family, this could be a family of any kind of origin on some sort of track to immigrant integration and citizenship. It's the migrant point of view when they are the winners, but they've only, that in some sense, that those that win this particular game are the proof of the fact that those of us that always were winners in the lottery of life and the unequal distribution of citizenship in the first place are those, it emphasizes just how unquestioned and automatic that particular stratification is. So the successful migrant, in other words, in the book, as I kind of pull out this argument, is the one celebrating a success, but it forgets all of those who are left behind because of the wrong human capital, the wrong nationality, race, religion, current country of origin, etc. So integration in the end for the few is also exclusion for the many, and the way in which global inequalities are reproduced, I think, at the heart of our unequal world population system.
Okay, terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now,
Apologies
Sara,
for the rapidness of this,
Oh.
but we can go into details, of course.
Okay, terrific. Sara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Adrian, thank you for your contribution in your presentation today. This is a big swing, and I want to begin by applauding big swings because I don't think we do it nearly enough, and they can be really agenda setting if we, when we take them seriously and we discuss them. And so with that in mind, I want to raise some concerns that I have, but mostly I want to sort of take you on your premise that you want to engage and have quantitative scholars take seriously your critiques. So my critiques are kind of framed in that view that how do we learn from this? What do you want us to take away from this work? I'm going to put on my quantitative scholar hat for the time being, and that was kind of how I read this. Just to put into different words what your argument is, to help some of the audience members, because they probably haven't had a chance to read the book yet, right? So this is a critical reflection on integration as a concept, the term itself, how we use it, where it came from, what it means, the fact of it, right? That the ongoing bordering inherent to integration, as is the study of it, right, is a practice of covert racialization, overt nationalism, and this occurs in a variety of ways, right? How we use the term native born, right? And we sort of unproblematically use the term native born to distinguish between immigrants and non-immigrants, right? In those kinds of practices, right? And that we think of integration as a way that states can get a grip on diversity. That's a term that you use. So this was kind of, so that argument itself, right? So with the call for the kind of the total rethinking of the conventional idea of integration. And then sort of the second argument here is that essentially we have Americanized or globalized integration, that how Western European states use integration is essentially a globalized version of the American practice, both kind of theoretically and more so empirically, like as you note the last slide being a British citizenship ceremony, which was literally designed to parrot the American one. Okay, so I want to start with where we both agree, because the bottom line for me is like, yeah, I buy the argument. I enter the book, I'm on your side. We both have a concern about the objective of integration, that you need this theory of society, that people know what they're integrating into, that there's some sort of, we all operate under the implicit belief that there is this coherent national group set of integration outcomes that we're asking people to come into. We both agree that that's problematic, right? That it goes unstated what the outcome of integration is. I was just mentioning at the beginning, I wrote this whole book, Citizenship in Hard Times, which, it doesn't even get to the immigrants, because the whole focus of the book is, what do people think is a good citizen? People that aren't immigrants, people that were born in the United States or born in the UK. What do they think it means to be a good citizen? Because we do so much work to ask immigrants to become good citizens that, for me, it was problematic that we kind of don't understand what the baseline is. So we agree on that point, that that's a problem. We agree on the paradoxical construction of integration, that it is at the same time both this modern concept and inherently conservative, right? That where the goal is stability, making sense out of diversity, right? Building unity from diversity. So we agree on that, and we agree that there are a lot of sinners here. Nation states, right, for having this sort of flattened, globalized model. Academics in our usage, our measurement, our verbiage, our comparisons, policymakers for how they collect data or not, lots of sinners. And I'm going to focus really on kind of the academics and what their responsibility is. So this is where I want to start raising the critiques. So like I said, I buy the argument. I'm on your side. I enter this and I want to agree with you, but I just don't see the evidence. The way that you describe the field is not the way that I see it. And I want to explain why. So as I read this book, I'm wondering if this is really a critique about the problems of sociology, if this is a critique about certain sociologists, or if this is a statement about the field of migration and citizenship studies as a whole. because I think it's important to recognize that this is an interdisciplinary field. And that's where the strengths are, right? That we can have political scientists talk about rules alongside sociologists that talk about the consequences of those rules. But to me, it was like you planted a lot of landmines, but not a lot of them went off. So what do I mean by that? Let me start with the conceptual standardization, right? So Americanization of integration. You write the transatlantic convergence on the American model as kind of the crux of your argument. So I disagree with how you've characterized the baseline. What does this mean? What is the American model? You write that the distinctive features of nation building in the United States are overlooked, citing Roger, citing Zolberg, but not, I see Irene's on the call, right? Or not Roger Smith or Noah Pincus or Susan Martin or Hiroshi, he's also on the call. Debbie Shilkrat, like a lot of people have theorized nation building in the United States through citizenship, through integration. So like the baseline itself was like, okay, well, what are we talking about? What is being Americanized? I guess I had a different empirical sense of what you mean here. The empirical description, I think, is truncated as you describe it. So you talk about integration, but the opposite in the US model is segregation, a term which doesn't appear very much in your narrative. And it's important because we only got to integration as a liberal concept because we worked through the illiberal concept of segregation. So when we are exporting the American model, or whoever is doing the exporting or importing or globalization of the American model, it's because one could argue that it is really the diffusion of international liberal norms in a post-civil rights era. And so it is the experience of having gotten to what is integration today, less so than, this is not the Americanization of the 1920s that is being exported. So it's a product of its time. And I think that kind of the opposite of that also needs to be acknowledged, because if you raise an issue with how we measure integration, well, what is it that exists between integration and segregation? We kind of euphemistically talk about disintegration. That was a term that you used a couple of times, but like we need the words and the concepts to fill in that gap. And I think that that is a worthwhile exercise, which maybe is an invitation for researchers, but is not something that I think you critically address in your analysis. So that's sort of the baseline of what you understand integration to be exported, so to speak. The explicit agenda towards international comparison that you talk about. So these are, I read this two ways. There are the explicit comparisons of the US to other countries, and there's the implicit comparison of how integration works in the US. So starting with the comparison, I just don't see this in my reading of integration studies today. Political scientists that engage in transatlantic comparisons are really sidelined. That is hard work to publish. Cross-national work that includes European cases seldom also include the United States. I actually was pushing to think of examples beyond Alba and Fahner, beyond Koopmans, who those two examples reappear in your analysis. And I was trying to think of others. Matt Wright was maybe one of the only other people, and he would attest to how difficult that kind of work is. So I just don't see that kind of explicit comparison in practice, nor do I see kind of the over flattening of integration. If anything, we see it in the opposite direction, that I'll talk about that in a second, but that the way that scholars study integration today is so opposite of generalized, that it's so, integration with adjectives. We're talking about economic integration, political integration, social integration, culture, that actually there's very little to generalize because of problems of external validity. So that I'll get to in a second. So I don't see the explicit comparisons of the US to other countries as you describe, nor the implicit comparisons. I don't think anyone believes integration happens in other countries the way it happens in the US. I think that it's still predominantly the conventional wisdom that integration in the US is different because of some of these historical examples that you do cite. But integration never, I wrote, is never a DV without adjectives. Okay, so that's sort of one bucket of concerns I have in terms of how you conceptualize American integration, how we talk about what that model looks like globally. Second is the mechanical standardization of integration. So you talk a lot about policy indices, right? You write that the sort of the broader mobilities and how it might impact different cases. I don't think that scholars believe integration happens the same way in different cases, like I said, but that's also not what these policy indices tell us. So you talk about MIPEX, and it is there's a long documentation of people that disagree with how MIPEX is, how it measures policy, because the outcomes are not what the policy is or isn't, but whether the policy is good for integration or not. It is explicitly normative. And a lot of scholars, myself included, have written about how that is problematic, but that is not how policy indices generally look. And there is this is a cottage industry, right, of people that want to measure what policies are. And this is a different enterprise than how policies are practiced, what the consequences of policies are, and that's a different conversation. But where you see diffusion of these, like, it's not that everyone thinks integration happens the same way, but if there are diffusion of policies, that itself is a worthwhile puzzle to study, why states adopt certain policy configurations that other states have. So I think that researchers are a lot more careful than you give them credit for when it comes to indices. The third point is gaps. So you talk a lot about the benchmark problem, that when we measure the differences between immigrants and native born, and that, of course, to echo the first observation I made, that is a problem when it goes unaddressed. And I think that we have tools like explicit positionality to think about what we're capturing there. But again, I don't think that most scholars measure integration via gaps. I think most scholars measure integration today with time series data, with life course studies, to look at just overall improvement. Now, you could be making an argument here that just the idea of improvement as integration is problematic, and that maybe is true. But in terms of thinking about what the field looks like as it is, I don't think that that's sort of a correct characterization of how studies look, either both cross-nationally or over time. Related, I would actually describe the field and the data problem, as you mentioned in your presentation, exactly opposite. The rich data is in Europe. The rich microdata comes out of Europe, and the majority of casework today uses Norway and Denmark and Switzerland because they have rich microdata. And so this is where, this presents a different set of problems, but not the problems as you see, or as you described. Academics have reified integration models. Again, I don't see that to be true. I don't view kind of deductive approaches to analysis that lean heavily on assimilationism or multiculturalism within the past 10 years. So again, this appears to read more as a focused critique of Bertossi and Fahner, Koopmans, to a lesser extent Jopke. But this that's not how kind of the field looks from my perspective, from my vantage point. You make a comment about lacking a sense of accumulated wisdom, that there's a proliferation of research, but not accumulated wisdom. Only speaking myself here from the perspective of citizenship, I don't, perhaps I'm more optimistic than you, but I think we've learned a lot about who gets citizenship and who doesn't, what the effects of certain rules and policy configurations are, about the consequences of having citizenship or not. Two more quick points. So I wanted to push back a bit about racialization and the use of ethnicity in survey work or quantitative work more generally. So this includes observational work, that treating national origin as a proxy for ethnicity or race. Yes, that is a problem. And you seem to suggest that it reifies the problem, it creates more problems, sort of like a criticism of what multiculturalism would be like, right, by treating people as groups or reifying them as groups. But I kind of wanted to push back a bit, because if the opposite of recognizing them is rendering them invisible, then I don't see a path forward to taking concerns seriously. So you talk about intra-EU migration and the sociology of whiteness, but in naming it as such, we learn more than in ignoring it. So I don't know that there's one rule for, dialing back on using Black or Latino labels and working with, US data, but in adding whiteness to our studies. So like, I don't think there's one rule, but I think that there is something lost. Maybe the critique is actually that we're using it to minoritize individuals, which would be a conversation that has important implications for how quantitative scholars do their work. And so it's something I'm happy to talk more about. And then the last point is, citizenship ceremonies may be a type of theater, but they're not meaningless. So I read your last point and the one that you presented as being a little cynical, if not a little sarcastic, I couldn't tell, but it does belittle the meaning and the agency of the work that people do to pass this barrier. I mean, I've sat in on dozens of ceremonies, and I can conclude that while they are a type of theater, that doesn't make them sort of just as kind of a cynical tool for the state to present itself in a certain light. So that said, I still agree with the argument, but not with the evidence that you use. I think the political science community commits a number of sins that support your point, but these aren't them, right? We still study native attitudes. We still have design-based, all these consequences that stem from design-based inference, primarily external validity concerns that actually, speak to some of your points more specifically. I would argue political science suffers from the opposite problem as you describe. We haven't flattened integration or taken deductive model-based approaches. They're so context-specific that we can't learn much about other places or about general patterns. So we can't say big things. And so relatedly, we have really limited theorization about who should, or what the citizenship premium is or should be, measuring effects of citizenship, et cetera. Okay, so that said, I'm not critical because I'm a grumpy pessimist. I am pragmatic because I am an optimist. I think that everyone wants to do better. I think the purpose of cumulative knowledge is that we can do better. So I ask one set of questions. What are we supposed to do with this book? What do you want us to learn? How do you want quantitative scholars, political scientists, other people in the interdisciplinary field of migration citizenship to take these critiques seriously, to implement them, to move the discipline forward? Thank you.
Okay, Sara, thank you so much. This is exactly the type of pointed comment that we're always looking for and all too rarely receive. So thanks a million. And back to you, Adrian, if you could respond relatively
briefly,
yeah,
because I'd rather
engage the audience. I'm sure people
listen to
will
reactions
have a lot
and
to
thoughts.
say.
Yeah. Thank you, Sara. Yeah, I mean, I think the real response to this kind of set of comments would need to be in the detail, and I think also we need to kind of get into written detail about some of the the kind of comments you're making about the literature and citations and so forth, which I mean, I think there's a certain stylization of what I say in the book about the American literature. I do think it's the canon, and we all know what the canon is, and we don't perhaps sufficiently we perhaps underestimate just how powerful that canon has been in shaping the paradigm. I think a lot of what you're doing, it's a sort of level of analysis issue. I mean, you're getting into details that are not necessarily stressing what I think is the really fundamental issue, which is the ways in which modes of doing this research, whether or not it recognizes itself in the critique I'm making, is reproducing global inequalities. It's really not taking on board issues that are very central to the literature on critical border studies and the critical migration studies people. So, I mean, I think what I'm trying to do as a service to the field in some ways is bring those worlds of discussion into contact, and it's very explicit in the GEMS article that I mentioned, the annual lecture, because there is no dialogue going on, between Nick de Geneva and some of the contemporary quantitative scholars or whatever. And that's where I think we should, it's not a cynical kind of set of comments about citizenship ceremonies, but raising a really difficult and problematic and uncomfortable question about the ways in which we celebrate positive progressive outcomes without addressing the fact of global inequalities, and the fact that global inequalities are reproduced every time there is a successful immigrant integration in some ways. And if it's not being reproduced, it's not being reproduced because of some sort of counter dynamic, which is creating a more transnational and less nationalized world. I think a lot of what I'm doing is also restating and recycling, in some sense, the transnational critique of standard thinking about immigration. But that also itself needs reassessing and reconsidering in the light of the fact that transnationalism, cosmopolitanism, diaspora studies, and all kinds of other things that we were so enthusiastic about in the 1990s have also become subject and, as it were, co-opted and corrupted by being also facets of the neoliberalism that produced the world that we're living in. So what I hope the book is an attempt to get down to the real underlying problematic of how we carve out a rather narrow and I think technologically problematic, because it is very methodologically nationalist form of studies of immigration, integration, assimilation, and citizenship, and so forth, without getting to grips with this issue around the polarization of mobilities versus migration and the ongoing reproduction of global inequalities. Let's open this up to some discussion. I do hope that I can persuade you, Sara, to provide us with a written version of this, perhaps in some symposium form, so that I can get to grips with the details a bit. I did want to say, I think it's stylized on the American side. I think what I'm presenting on the European side is a bit more state of the art, and it's really the European side that there's a problem. It's the fact that European scholars are not problematizing their very, I think, obvious ways in which their whole work has been structured by an American literature in its technicalities. And that's really where I think the problems lie. And so, you talk about Norway, Denmark, Switzerland, or whatever. Yes, all of the research going on in those places, all of the data being produced, all of the mechanical ways of operationalizing this are reproducing the categories of Norway, Denmark, and Switzerland as nations, and that's the problem. That's the basic problem that we face. I do think the book, there is a chapter on race and integration that deals very explicitly with integration and segregation and the black-white issue and the color line and all of those things, and how they intersect with classic studies of immigration. So I don't accept that particular charge, and I think the book does also something valuable there in bringing race back into the picture, and engaging with critical race studies, engaging with the British race literature in ways that most immigration researchers don't do. So, but that's another sort of issue perhaps, but which was not reflected very much in the talk I gave today.
Okay, terrific, thank you. So, questions? Comments? Please raise your hand and I will. Irene Blomrand.
Oh, it's Irene, sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Irene. Hi there.
This is the advantage of Zoom world, right? That we can actually have this conversation. I received your book, but I have not yet read it. So you will have to excuse my question from a position of absolute ignorance. I liked some of the things that Sara said, and so I look forward to reading the text. I think I agree with her that I think doing the comparative integration research, which crosses the Atlantic, is incredibly difficult. I think the Europeans do a lot of studies amongst themselves, but I think US sociological migration studies remains incredibly parochial. Now, maybe it feels imperialistic for you, but here it just feels like very insular, I think would be one way of saying it. I want to ask a broad normative question, because I took very seriously Sarah's last question to you, like, what do you want to do with this book and sort of the arguments that you've set forth? And I want to ask a question about how you would re-envision then a notion of membership, or do you just want to explode that construct completely? And I don't know if a transnational or a mobilities approach means just exploding membership. And I'm going to take an example of something that I participated in 2 weeks ago, which again is maybe tangential, but I think it's super interesting. So I was up in Canada in Alberta, and I was at a meeting with a number of Indigenous scholars who were presenting work on ideas of membership and belonging from the perspective of Indigenous communities. And some of the themes that came very strongly from those scholars in the scholarship is that just because you have one Indigenous ancestor 4 generations ago, you cannot be Indigenous. So it questions self-report data about your ethnicity or your ancestry. So the Indigenous communities would reject somebody who says, I am Indigenous because I have that, ancestor somewhere back. And they articulated a notion of belonging and membership that was much more thick. It had to be with social relations, related to kinship, related to gifts and reciprocal obligations, a sense of community, a sense of knowing the history. Basically, a lot of things that I think migration scholars would consider sort of a ethnic conception of nation, or at least in a sense, very exclusionary, because they were not very interested in allowing new members within the community. And this, of course, is a reaction to settler colonialism and a way of asserting sovereignty. But that is an alternative notion of membership. And it's coming from marginalized communities who are reacting to what you've talked about in terms of liberalism, neoliberalism, capitalism, et cetera. But as an immigration scholar, I felt incredibly uncomfortable, because while I recognized why this notion of thick membership based on ancestry or history and ties was really important for these communities, I thought, wow, like if we live in a place with migrants or mobilities, does that just mean that we have to have treaty relationships within and among each other? Like, do we all live in segregated spaces, or do we have to like what kind of notion of membership evolves from that kind of model? And so thinking of where is the future if we break apart integration, one is transnational, mobilities, maybe diasporic, and other would be like, could you imagine that in a small working class village in England that is feeling left behind, that these people could adopt an Indigenous notion of what membership is and say, the only people who are allowed to be in, I don't know what the name would be, St. Andrews on the Field, are the people who have been here, who have kinship ties forever, who really understand the community, and we are under attack by neoliberalism. And so therefore it makes total sense for us to close the doors and really look inwards.
Yeah, but it's closing the doors nationally, isn't it? Not closing the doors on the village. So, I mean, the whole point of the book is about where national power comes from, the nation state power comes from, that sort of membership. So I don't see any problem with the indigenous membership in marginal, peripheral, disadvantaged, subordinate groups and so forth are generating power from this, and they're pushing back.
Well, no, the indigenous people they say they are nations. Like I mean, it's very clear that their claims are of sovereignty,
Well, yeah, they're like
self-governance,
independentist movements in that sense. Yeah. I mean, you're alluding to a very, what is one of the key and core deep problematic debates that are out there. That this sort of problematization of indigenous rights claims versus migrant and mobile rights claims, and how that plays out in different ways. And there's a very heated debate over this that's very divisive amongst left-wing scholars on the left, with different sorts of positions. Yeah, I think there's a bit of an elision there. They're nations, but we talk about nation states. It might be interesting to try and consider what sorts of plural or federalized state forms maybe could come out of these sorts of movements, perhaps on a minority level, and that's perhaps where things get more interesting, and where the Canadian nationhood becomes something different because of the relativization of multiple sorts of federal and minority or indigenous sorts of claims within it somehow. But there's a brute fact that we live in highly nationalized democracies that in the end come down, the big power question comes down to presidential elections or to referenda that decide the fate of the nation and so forth, and how people get mobilized for that is really the key kind of issue. I think far too much work has been done with these sorts of stylized arguments about angry white working class people who don't want to accept immigrants and so forth. I mean, I think it doesn't really bear the population, the reality of populations in these places, the diversity in them, or the class dynamics and so forth. So, I think I address all those. I address all of these sorts of questions and issues in the book, and I side with a certain sort of argument that is, might look rather destructive or politically aggressive or something from the point of view of people that are trying to sort of manage these things in a more progressive and multicultural kind of way, I guess.
Okay, other questions? Yes, Gerardo Ortega.
Yes, thank you. Well, I haven't read the book, but I found the presentation and the comments very, very interesting. It seems to me like, I've seen this issue that was presented by Irene in Mexican indigenous communities as well, that they have, these different notions of citizenship. And that's in part because, these communities tend to be very much sending communities, right? And some of them are receiving migrants back. And so, but sometimes, some of these migrants come back at, let's say, age 50 or something, and, they will represent an undue burden to the community if they have not already participated in reciprocity relationships and so on and so forth. But I live actually in unceded territory of the Coast Salish nations in Canada, in Vancouver. And I would say, side commentary, I guess, to Irene is that the very notion of nation was imposed by the Canadian state, I would say. But from the point of view of the so-called First Nations, I don't think they have any desire to start, having embassies, etc., in other places. It's not equivalent to the nation states. So, they're ethnic groups, indigenous groups, and I guess that concept of nation is also utilized in Ecuador, for instance, where they in the constitution, they introduced the concept of plurinationality. By the way, I guess we're talking at two different levels of analysis here. And it would be, I mean, we cannot establish a parallel between First Nations or indigenous groups or First Peoples on the one hand and nation states on the other hand. I mean, that's just one thing I want to comment. The other, which I think is extremely important, is I was thinking of a concept that was proposed about 10 years ago or so by Alejandro Portes of rather than integration, modes of incorporation. And it seems to me like these modes of incorporation look not just at whether or how immigrants integrate or become assimilated, but how they become incorporated. And I think that really brings up the relational aspect of the extent to which the receiving society becomes a welcoming place to immigrants or not. And I think that's where we have huge differences among receiving societies. For instance, I mean, the way I see it, France would have a lot more problems than Canada in receiving or incorporating migrants. And I think the US also has a lot more problems than Canada has in incorporating migrants, partly because I mean, Canada defines itself as a multinational or multicultural society, whereas the US is, you know, the, what would be the, you know, the melting pots, right? I mean, everybody is expected to become integrated or assimilated. Not so in Canada. So, you know, what are the differences that can result from these differential approaches from receiving nations to resulting modes of incorporation? I don't know if that was too convoluted. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, Adrian.
Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, I'd want to give way to others on questions of indigenous politics and so forth. It's not, you know, it's not at the heart of what I do, and not in any way an expert. But yeah, I think that my understanding of discussions amongst in the indigenous politics literature about sovereignty, precisely, you know, state power, is precisely for thinking about other forms of political organization. You know, that they have a lot of parallels with anarchist type thinking and so forth, that it's not state-centered and so on. So yes, you know, I think that was the point that was being made in a way. I think, yeah, I don't accept this. You get out of the problem that I'm raising by talking about incorporation or inclusion or any of the other euphemisms that are used for integration. That's a key point that I make in my work. I think these are all words talking about the same theoretical problem, and Portes, like everybody else, is doing work that is looking at the formation, the origins, formations of a particular society in which there's very little, there's not the way in which this is conceived and then thought of and measured and qualitatively described in terms of intercultural interactions or whatever, continues to produce this border that is the border of the national society in some sense, that is out there and is structuring this this process. And when it doesn't, it ought to be described in other terms, which is a kind of as a denationalization. You know, if there is something transnational going on, it is a denationalization, and that cannot be described in terms of incorporation or inclusion or assimilation, integration, and so forth. So I sort of make a very categorical claim in the book about this mode of thinking, and precisely because a lot of scholars, as I said earlier in the talk, try and work in this space of interculturalism, and they try and go local, and they try and talk about, you know, okay, we don't want to talk about the nation state, we want to talk about these wonderful integration things that are going on at local levels because of cultural interactions and so forth. In a sense, no, at some point we have to deal with the issue of sovereignty, and we have to deal with the issue of state power and how that is related to the recuperation of these sorts of processes as national processes that we then celebrate in all the standard ways.
Okay, David Abraham.
Yes, hi, Adrian. So
I
I
know.
want to return to the question of your normative preferences. Given the emphasis that you've placed, I haven't seen this book, but given the emphasis you've placed today in discussion on global inequality and the negative contribution of these policies of integration and immigration to global inequality, what is the normative framework that immigration/integration policy should adopt if the lessening of global inequality is one of the goals we seek?
Good. Well, I mean, that's the big philosophical question, obviously. Perhaps because I am a philosopher, I'm more comfortable with problematizing and not necessarily, I mean, working towards solutions rather than suggesting that there is a very easy solution to this particular question is, of course, the point. And I'm first of all trying to get us to recognize the problem, which is, I think, not recognized at the heart of a lot of migration studies, the problem of global inequalities. And obviously, there's a literature I'm also channeling and referring to, of course, out there, notably Eilert Shakar. That then raises the issues of, well, okay, so are you proposing is this a Joseph Caron's morally? Is this some sort of no borders, kind of celebratory no borders type of argument? And that also gets into difficulties. I mean, there are ways in which this particular argument is also can continue to reproduce various sorts of colonial types of inequalities. And so I would invite you to look at the latter end of the book is really trying to wrestle with this problem, to try and identify what are the criteria for certain sorts of migrations that might be classified that might constitute a kind of migration as decolonization. So engaging with your colleagues' work at Tendai Yechum is kind of a restatement in some sense of a post-national argument. I mean, I don't see it as radically different from what post-national scholars were saying in the 1990s, but there is a more explicit formulation of post-nationalism as a decolonial movement, which I try to kind of articulate in this book, and which I then try to go on to identify modes in which forms of migrant organization that look like types of transnational organization that are explicitly channeling away power from receiving states, acting as forms of reparation to sending states, disrupting the standard dominant relationship of colonial powers to the rest of the world, and so forth. And I think that's where, that's for me is where the heartland of critical migration studies needs to be. It needs to be really thinking about, how do we identify forms of international migration that are undermining the nation state system and the implicit power that is continually asserted by advanced liberal Western democracies, the North Atlantic West, and its self-promotion in terms of successful immigrant integration citizenship models, progressive liberal democracy as we know it. So that literally is what the book is trying to do. So,
okay, David Jacobson, we just have a few minutes, so if you can make it direct, and then Adrian a quick response.
I'll try do my best, but first I'll say, Adrian, I think this is I haven't read the book, but it's a terrific project. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential we ask these questions. I think the disciplines, the social sciences, seem to adapt very slowly, and methodological nationalism, the use of certain categories, certain data sets. And so to generate that conversation, I think would be terrific. But I would, in a way, be more radical than what you are saying in the following sense, and it's hard to get in a few words. But the problem you know, integration, people, the conversation even following your presentation has talked about terms like segregation versus integration, incorporation, which you commented on. But that's still reproducing some of these categories, you know, of membership. It's sort of looking at that horizontal level. It's still engaging in a kind of demographic reductionism. And that's true for race too, by the way. You know, there's sort of race gets naturalized at the Enlightenment. There's no reason, you know, we need to look at it separately from ethnicity. And you can go even to the pre-colonial period, to Westphalia, where this kind of sorting is going on, right, at the Treaty of Westphalia, between nations, the idea of the nation state. Once you talk about the nation state, you have to think, who's the nation? What happens with the outsiders? And I think in all this, that we've simplified the idea of citizenship. And overwhelmingly, the discussion about citizenship is about membership, when citizenship is a much more complex thing. You know, we're sort of dealing on that horizontal level, but not the vertical level, except as derivative of talking of membership, of ethnicity, of these kinds of things. And so I think it's, you know, another way. It would be great to move from the critical to thinking exactly what other ways can we think about that. And I think the lens would be looking at citizenship and looking at it more holistically. For example, the binary sense we have of citizenship now comes out of the same things you're critiquing, the idea of a fixed bordered nation state. So it's not an argument. And by the way, you know, it's a mistake people make about the post-national argument. It was never about a borderless world. It's a question of how we look at these borders. And, you know, citizenship as it's practiced is not binary. You know, all kinds of relationships are going on. Undocumented, others, in a legal sense, it's binary, but we see all kinds of seamed relationships taking place all the time. So I know I have very little time. There's more I'd love to talk to you about, but I think this is a wonderful project. And I think that to the extent a conversation can be, you know, can be engaged on these sort of fundamental epistemological questions, which can lead to much else, right? In terms, not just how we analyze, but start thinking, how do we move forward in a world which is getting incredibly complex? And yet we're using these categories from, you know, 20, 30 years ago. So I'll end there.
Okay, thank you. Adrian, if you could quickly respond.
Yeah, I mean, I took that as a commentary and in some sense an affirmation of what I'm trying to do in the book, which of course is go back to the kind of work you did, David, and others, problematizing these things in the 1990s, but looking at it now in the light of, you know, the post 2008 disasters and crises and so forth that we're living through, and the book goes, you know, brings us right up to date with COVID as well. So, and yeah, we need to be thinking about these issues. And I just, I suppose that there's the point might have been a variation on the kind of criticism of, well, are you reifying integration by even talking about integration and so on? And I think that's where the key attempt, at least, to move to position this in a place where it is also debating conceptually, at least, with people who are doing the conventional mainstream research is important, because there's tons and tons of critical and theoretical work that obviously is exploring the conceptual issues that you're raising, but which doesn't engage in that way. So there's a lack of engagement on both sides, and I try and position myself in the middle of that, and perhaps therefore get shot at by both sides. So.
Okay, so on that note, so thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thanks especially to all of you who have been with us for much or all of this year. Thanks to Adrian for a terrific presentation, and for Sara for such a wonderful comment. So I wish you all.
Thank you for the comments, and yeah, very
enjoyable,
very
pleasant
comment.
summer, and of course a healthy summer. And we will resume. CCIS and CSIM will resume with some form of collaboration next year. So until late September, early October, have a great summer,
Or August,
everyone.
maybe.
Stay healthy, and see you in fall 2022.
Right.